それではお待たせいたしました。これから基調講演を始めさせていただきます。本日の基調講演の講師は、ハーバード大学教授、ハーバード大学ウクライナ研究所所長、セルヒー・プロヒー様にお越しいただいております。では、プロヒーさん、どうぞステージにお越しください。皆様、拍手でお迎えください。Yes, please. では私の方からセルヒー・プロヒーさんのプロフィールを簡単にご紹介させていただきます。セルヒー・プロヒーさんはロシア及び東欧の第一人者であり、第二次世界大戦及び冷戦の国際的歴史に関して多数の論文を発表されています。国際関係に関する最優秀英語書籍に与えられる賞であるライオネル・ゲルバー賞や、イギリスのノンフィクション作品に対して贈られる賞であるベイリー・ギフォード賞を含めた多数の受賞歴をお持ちです。本日はウクライナ戦争が突きつける21世紀の挑戦、核、サイバー、経済安全保障、情報、民主主義をテーマにご講演いただきます。それではプロヒーさん、よろしくお願いいたします。So, Mr. Prohi, the stage is yours.
Well, thank you very much. It's a real pleasure and honor to be here. Earlier today, I visited the site of one of the epicenter of the atomic bombing of Hiroshima, the atomic dome, and it's something that reminds us about the horrible way in which the nuclear age really started at the end of World War II. And the wonderful nature, the park around that building, half-destroyed building, gives, of course, hope, a lot of hope, that anything of that kind would not be repeated in the future. Unfortunately, we are today in another very, very difficult moment in world history, in global history. And the moment that reminds us again and again through the media, through statements that are made by politicians, that the nuclear age that started in 1945 right here in Hiroshima, that it didn't end, it didn't come to an end with the end of Cold War. The nuclear weapons remain to be a major an important factor in international relations, and the Russian aggression against Ukraine brought back veiled and not so veiled threats about the use of nuclear weapons. The war in Ukraine went nuclear also in a different way by, for the first time in history, the warfare coming to the nuclear sites, to the sites of the nuclear power plants, from Chernobyl to Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, the largest nuclear power plant in Europe. There is a number of ways to think about what is happening today in Ukraine and around in Ukraine, in world as a whole. I am a historian, and I'm really honored to be invited to talk to the captains of business and industry and provide a historical perspective on what is going on, and also historical perspective on what can happen in the world. Some tendencies that this war produced, put to the fore, they certainly will continue, and this historical lens, it allows us to think and maybe to see a little bit further than other fields of knowledge, other fields of inquiry allow us to do that. So that is the main really goal of my presentation today, to use history as the way not only to look into the past, but also as a way to understand the present, and maybe to think about the future, about the possible scenarios in the future, and then hopefully act accordingly. I have here another piece of equipment. I understand that this is for me to move my slides. I wonder if I can ask, okay, the organizers, thank you very much. The slides, the opening slide is already there, and now I will try, okay, the green one, thank you. Yes, of course, that makes sense. Okay, here we are with my first slide, and that's where I would want to start the discussion about the origins of this war. This war is the largest military conflict in Europe since the end of World War II. It has different names, but one way how it is called, certainly it is called Putin's war. And Vladimir Putin is certainly the figure that has been at the center of this developments, dramatic and tragic developments of the not just last year, but of the last 10 plus years. And he was there certainly to formulate and to articulate, present his vision of why this war happened and why it was, at least from his perspective, a necessity. One of the key arguments that he put forward was that Russia really had to react to the extension of NATO, the eastern extension of NATO, something that happened starting since the beginning of the millennium, and the war was a response to that particular challenge. One thing that is very obvious today, which probably was less obvious 1 year ago, that NATO and the expansion of NATO, even if it was to a different degree maybe part of concern for Moscow, was not certainly the main concern. If it would be the main concern, then Vladimir Putin would not put forward the conditions for negotiations that were really, really unrealistic, demanding NATO to kick out from the NATO the countries, the East European countries that worked so hard for the long period of time after the fall of Berlin Wall to make their way into the Euro-Atlantic institutions. If NATO would be really important and crucial for the Russian actions in that war, there would be a very different reaction coming from Moscow to the so-called de-Finlandization of Finland. The fact that Finland joined the NATO, doubling the length of the border that the Russian Federation had with the NATO countries before that. Sweden certainly declared its desire to join NATO and is on the way to joining NATO. We don't see the Russian troops leaving Ukraine and in a hurry moving to the border with Finland. If NATO would be a concern, that would have to be the proper response to what was happening with Finland and what is happening with Sweden. It didn't happen. NATO was not the only explanation that was provided by Mr. Putin. Another one dealt with the issues of history. One of his speeches was on the 22nd of February of 2022, a few days before the start of the war, was dubbed by the observers as a history lecture. Before that, a few months earlier, in the summer of 2021, Vladimir Putin published a long article, a historical expose that was called "On the Historical Unity of Russians and Ukrainians." History was really and continues to be an important part of Kremlin's thinking about this war and about its causes. One of the key arguments that was put forward in the article, in the speeches, was the argument that really Ukrainians didn't exist or were not supposed to exist as a separate nation. The argument was formulated in a way that Russians and Ukrainians are one and the same people. What of course meant was not that Russians are really Ukrainians. What meant that Ukrainians were really Russians, and they had to be liberated from the yoke of and control that was allegedly imposed over them by the radicals, nationalists, and Nazis, led allegedly by President of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, the only president of Jewish background anywhere in the world outside of Israel. So on the surface, at least, that argument made not more sense than argument about NATO. But what was there was a long tradition of the Russian thinking about Russia itself and about its relations with its neighbors. This slide that I am showing now comes really from the 19th century, and it embodies the imperial vision of what was Russian nation and what was Russia. At the center of that image is the image of a woman who symbolizes Russia or Great Russia, so in today's language, in today's understanding, the Russians themselves. Next to that woman is a woman in Ukrainian garbs, national garbs. In Russian Empire, they were called, Ukrainians were called Little Russians. And next to, on the other side, it's another woman who symbolizes Belorussia. So imperial vision of Russia and Russian nation that was there in the 19th century and was there until the start of World War I was that there existed a big Russian nation that consisted of three tribes: Russians, Ukrainians, and Belarusians. So in bringing argument in the 21st century about Russians and Ukrainians being one and the same people, what Putin was really doing was going back to the arsenal of Russian empire and Russian imperial thinking. He was very critical of the creators of the Soviet Union, including Lenin, and even Joseph Stalin didn't get high marks from the current leader of Russia in terms of handling the nationality question. And the reason for that was that the Bolsheviks managed to put back together, stitch together, the former Russian Empire after it fell apart during World War I and the Revolution of 1917. They did that by making concessions, cultural concessions, to the nationalities of the Russian Empire that were brought together under the umbrella of the Soviet Union. And on this image, you see Joseph Stalin backed by the peoples of the Soviet Union, including representatives of different national groups, including Ukrainians, Russians, Georgians, Uzbeks, and others. So all of these nationalities received within the borders of the Soviet Union the elements of autonomous states or the Union republics. And that structure, pseudo-federal structure of the Soviet Union, that didn't mean much during the Cold War, for example, because the power was in Moscow, all the power was in Moscow, exercised through the highly centralized Communist Party. But that structure served as a foundation then and the basis on which the rights for independence were declared by individual republics when the Soviet Union came to its end. When the Cold War came to its end in the late 1980s, and then the Soviet Union fell apart. And from that point of view, Putin has been extremely critical about these concessions that were made by the Bolsheviks to the other republics, including Ukraine. That's what he writes in his article. That's what he declared in his speech. Which brings me to the more recent developments from the depth of history, from the medieval period or from the 19th century, to the period that is 30 plus years separates those developments from us today. What you see on this image are the leaders of the three Slavic republics, the same tribes, the same groups that were on the imperial poster. It's Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus. Now their leaders meet in December of 1991 in Belarus and sign a document which dissolves the Soviet Union, which is very interesting. The Slavic core of the Soviet Union, Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus, which was so central for the existence of the Russian Empire and then existence of the Soviet Union, now make a decision to dissolve the USSR, the Soviet Union. So any attempt on the part of Russia today to re-establish its control over the post-Soviet space really depends on its ability to unite in one way or another the Slavic core of the former USSR, of the Soviet Union. Ukraine is especially important for that particular project. This photo was taken 1 week after, in December of 1991, 1 week after the referendum on independence in Ukraine. Ukraine was the only republic of the Soviet Union out of 15 that held a referendum on independence. The question that was put forward for the Ukrainians to answer in that referendum was whether you support the decision of your parliament to declare independence of Ukraine. There was no question whether you want the Soviet Union to continue or not, in what way, in what form you want it to continue. Ukrainians, 92% of those who took part in the referendum, voted in favor of independence. 1 week later, the Soviet Union was dissolved. The question is why? The trick is that neither Mikhail Gorbachev, at that time the head of the Soviet Union, the general secretary of the party before that, and then the president of the Soviet Union, nor Boris Yeltsin, the president of Russia and Russian Federation, didn't imagine the continuation of the Soviet Union without Ukraine. Why Ukraine? Why not Belarus? Why not Lithuania? Why not Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan? The answer comes on a number of levels. One level is demographic and economic. Ukrainians were the second largest republic in the Soviet Union after Russia, in terms of the numbers. 54 million people at that time. It was economically the largest Soviet republic after Russia as well. So Russia didn't see it economically or politically feasible to continue with the Soviet project without second largest republic, Slavic republic, being a partner in that project. Yeltsin, on a number of occasions, explained to President George H.W. Bush Sr., that without Ukraine, Russia would be outnumbered and outvoted by Central Asian Muslim republics. So there was also the element of Slavic unity, common Orthodox Christian tradition that made it difficult and problematic for Russia to continue or try to reestablish the Soviet Union without Ukraine. What was born instead of the Soviet Union was called the Commonwealth of Independent States. And since its inception, it was led by Russia. Ukraine, that was one of the founding members of the Commonwealth, never formally joined the Commonwealth. And the reason for that was that Russia and Ukraine viewed differently the purpose of the Commonwealth. If for Russia, the goal was to use the Commonwealth as the way to maintain its control over the post-Soviet space, Ukraine looked at the Commonwealth as the way to achieve what in Kiev called at that time a civilized divorce. With the beginning of the new millennium, with the start of the economic recovery in Russia, the Kremlin came up with a number of projects for reintegration of the post-Soviet space. Vladimir Putin was thinking about the world not as a unipolar world dominated by the United States of America, the way how it was in the 1990s. But the model was a multipolar world in which Russia would be one of the poles of the new world. Now, for Russia to become one of the poles, and that means compete or be on par with the European Union to the west, and the map shows that, and with China in the east, Russia had to reestablish some form of control over the resources of the former Soviet space. Which brings me back to Ukraine, which remained and continued to be the second largest post-Soviet republic. So any reintegrationist project in the Eurasian space without the second largest component would have that hole right there, like you see on the map in all this preparations. That is the real background to the war, not NATO. History plays role, but history plays role in terms of Russian understanding of itself and Russian understanding of relationship with neighbors. But when it comes to geopolitics, the issue was the attempt to reestablish Russian control over the post-Soviet space, creation of Eurasian Union. And that map really explains the beginning of the war more than any pronouncements that have been made publicly. The war didn't start in February of 2022. The war started in February of 2014 with the Russian military takeover of the Crimea. So the Russian commanders in unmarked uniforms moved to the capital of the Crimea, the city of Simferopol. They take control over the building of the parliament and the building of the Council of Ministers, the government of the Crimea. They go to the city, they drag in the deputies of the Crimean parliament and make them to vote, first not on the issue of independence, but first on the issue of a separate constitution, a new constitution for Crimea, and then eventually independence as well. Why February 2014? What was there and how it is related to the map that I'm showing to you? In November 2013, in Ukraine, started the protest that became known as the Revolution of Dignity or Euro Revolution or European Revolution. The protests in downtown Kiev came in response to the refusal of the Ukrainian government to sign a document that they promised to Ukrainians to sign for more than 1 year. The document was called the Association Agreement. Ukraine was supposed to sign association agreement with European Union. Russia did everything in its power to stop the president of Ukraine at that time, Viktor Yanukovych, to sign that agreement. He refused to sign, got a promise of reward of $15 billion for that. But that produced protests. Protests led to the disposal of the removal of Yanukovych from power, and arrival to power of a new pro-European government. After that, within a short period of time, Russia moves in, occupies Crimea, and then a few months later starts, or a few weeks rather later, starts a hybrid warfare in eastern Ukraine, the region called Donbass. So at the core of that, the trigger for all these developments was a document called Association Agreement with European Union. It wasn't joining NATO. It wasn't a document about Ukraine becoming even a candidate member of European Union or not joining the European Union. It was association agreement, mostly trade, not only trade, but mostly trade. It was so important because if Ukraine would sign that agreement, and eventually Ukraine signed that agreement, the conditions of the agreement were saying that Ukraine can't join any other trade union, customs union, any other union of the sort that Putin was actually building at that time, the Eurasian Union. So it's not even about Ukraine going toward Europe and joining Europe. It's that document would actually preclude Ukraine joining the Eurasian Union that Vladimir Putin was working on. And that triggers eventually the start of the war, late February 2022. So that I will remind you once again where I started with the possible reasons, causes, triggers of the war, from the expansion of NATO to the imperial ambitions, but the direct reason, direct trigger was the association agreement with European Union. What you see here is the map of Ukraine with Russian takeover of the Crimea in late February and March of 2014. And then the plan for Ukraine was that Ukraine was supposed to change its constitution, give the rights to the regions like Donetsk and Luhansk the veto power over its foreign policy issues, and basically become ungovernable. So any movement toward the West would become impossible. Ukrainians refused to do that. Within the few weeks, Russia actually raised the stakes and started the hybrid warfare and started destabilization of eastern Ukraine, the region of Donetsk and Luhansk. The war that erupted led to signing of two agreements, Minsk I and Minsk II. Here you see the leaders of Belarus, Russia, Germany, France, and the president of Ukraine at that time, Petro Poroshenko, in which Ukraine that was trying to take over control over eastern Ukraine, over Donbass region, the Russian regular army was sent into the battle, first in August of 2014, and then the second time in January and February of 2015. The so-called Minsk agreements that were signed in Belarus were imposed on Ukraine, which had the following structure. Ukraine was supposed to conduct elections on these territories that were de facto occupied by Russia. And they were supposed then to be integrated into the Ukrainian legal space. So basically the goal was the same. Have the units de facto turning Ukrainian Confederation, having units of that state that would have de facto control over the country's foreign policy. Russia and Ukraine never agreed on the order in which that was supposed to be done. Ukraine was insisting that, okay, Ukraine would have these elections, but only after Ukraine reestablished sovereignty over those territories and moved to the border. Russia was saying, no, first you have 2 elections, which would be de facto under Russian control, and then you would have control over the border. And that story pretty much continued until February of 2022. And what we see with the start of the all-out war is the Putin's decision that the annexation of the Crimea, the hybrid warfare in Donbass really didn't achieve its goals. Ukraine continued its drift toward the West, integration into the European and transatlantic structures. Those structures didn't include NATO. NATO was not in a position to say, Ukraine, no, we will not take you. But privately, and Putin admitted that, every NATO leader was telling Putin that, well, Ukraine is not joining. We are not taking Ukraine in. But the issue of the integration, economic integration and political integration into Europe continued to be on the agenda. So that was real. Ukraine got visa-free status for travel into Europe. The economic ties actually were becoming less and less important between Ukraine and Russia. The majority of Ukrainian trade was reoriented toward Europe. So the process that Putin tried to stop back in 2014 really was gaining more and more momentum by the year 2021, by the year 2022. And eventually what we got in February of 2022 was an all-out war and all-out invasion. As I said earlier, the legitimization for that war was the idea that Russians and Ukrainians were one and the same people. Few people in Ukraine actually subscribed under that idea, but there was deep down thinking and feeling that, well, Russians and Ukrainians were really very close to each other. Good part of Ukrainian population, especially and in the east and in the south of the country, spoke Russian. So the war, the all-out war, with the missile attacks on the first day of the war, the first morning of the war, on Kyiv, which in Russia is considered to be the founding place of the Russian state. So things like that were completely unimaginable. And the war happened. The idea was that Kyiv would not survive for more than 3 days, that Ukraine would not survive for more than 2 weeks. The United States and Russia disagreed on everything when it comes to Ukraine, except this issue. There was general agreement that, unspoken and written, that Ukraine probably would not last for more than 2 weeks. We are now in the second year of the war. Ukraine surprised everyone, and Ukrainians surprised, I would say, probably themselves as well, by the sort of the resistance that they had shown toward this Russian aggression. The war in Ukraine contributed to the process of the disintegration of the former imperial modes and models of thinking in Russia, like no other development since the Ukrainian vote for independence back in 1991 and end of the Soviet Union. Ukrainians united on the platform of a political nation. War on the Ukrainian side is being fought today in both languages, in Ukrainian and in Russian. The areas that were hit the most by bombardment and destroyed almost completely, like the city of Mariupol, were mostly Russian-speaking cities. In Mariupol, more than 90% spoke Russian. The ethnic Russians constituted more than 40% of the population, which draws really the wedge, the division between Russia and Ukraine that didn't exist before, that contributes in a major way to the formation of a strong Ukrainian nation, political nation, but also with strong attachment to the cultural and historical issues associated with Ukraine. The war goes on, and we don't know yet when and how it will end. At least don't know, can't predict what will happen tomorrow, what will happen 1 month or 1 year from now. But we also see that there are certain things that war brought for the first time to the international agenda, and that's the issue, the nuclear issues. That's where I started. I will take now an opportunity to talk a little bit more about nuclear. When Soviet Union fell apart in 1991, Ukraine, as an independent country, was born nuclear. It had on its territory the 3rd largest nuclear arsenal in the world, 3rd after Russia and the United States. In the year 1994, Ukrainians were pressured through the joint efforts of the United States and Russia to give up its nuclear arsenal, all nuclear weapons, to go nuclear free, denuclearization. In exchange for a document that was called, there was a number of documents, but the final one was called Budapest Memorandum, where the United States, UK, France, then China joined as well, Russia was there from the very beginning, provided assurances to Ukraine, Kazakhstan, and Belarus. The part of the Soviet nuclear arsenal was also on the territory of Kazakhstan and Belarus, of territorial integrity and sovereignty of those states. With the start of the war, and especially all-out war in 2024, one thing that happened was that a major hole was created in the non-proliferation regime in the world as a whole. Everyone looks today at Ukraine, that was in the physical possession, not in terms of operating possession, in the physical possession of the 3rd largest nuclear arsenal in the world, gave it up, and was attacked and became the battleground in the most ferocious war in Europe since World War II. How many countries now, today, will agree to exchange their nuclear program or their nuclear weapons, if they have already nuclear weapons, in exchange for another document called Budapest Memorandum? Very few. Especially given that it wasn't the case in 2014, but became the case in 2022, that we have veiled threats. Not just the territory of Ukraine was attacked and violated, there are veiled threats of use nuclear weapons by Russia against Ukraine and possible targets in Ukraine. So the discussion is about the tactical nuclear weapons. So a Hiroshima type of bombs. This is something that, again, has echoes with the past, and very clear echoes with the past, but it's also, given the Budapest Memorandum, given the nuclear disarmament of Ukraine, that presents the entire world with a new situation and with new challenges, especially when it comes to non-proliferation regime. Another very, very important and threatening new development is what I already mentioned. The war for the first time came to the nuclear sites. There were cases before that the nuclear reactors that were producing the fuel for the nuclear bombs, or potentially could do that, were attacked. That is not new. But the warfare, the missiles, the territorial occupation of the nuclear sites, this is a new development. Which brings me to another name that comes from Japan, and that's Fukushima. In Chernobyl and now in Zaporizhzhia, there were already situations that made a number of observers to use this name again and again. Because what is Fukushima? It's about again, many things, but one of the key things is the electrical supply to the nuclear power plant is cut off. It was cut off here as the result of tsunami. It was cut off on a number of occasions in Zaporizhzhia already, and on one occasion in Chernobyl as the result of warfare. Zaporizhzhia today exists, it seems to me, on only one line that continues supply electricity to Zaporizhzhia. With the nuclear reactors being shut down, to keep them cool and keep them from meltdown, you need electricity coming from outside. So you here know that exceptionally well. There is no guaranteed supply of that electricity. Wasn't there before, and certainly no one can guarantee it now, especially given that everyone is talking today about the possible, or not even possible, the likely Ukrainian counteroffensive. This counteroffensive will be happening in southern Ukraine, will be happening in the area around, close to Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. We turned out as a world, as a whole, completely unprepared for that sort of development. There are 400 to 440 nuclear reactors in the world. None of them was designed with the idea that the warfare can be fought there. There is no procedures and no protocols. The operators don't know what to do and what not to do in the conditions of the war coming to the nuclear site. The units that protect the nuclear power plants, normally against terrorist attacks, don't know what to do and how to behave in the conditions of the war. In Chernobyl, they decided to lay down the weapons, were interned, now they're prisoners of war somewhere deep in Russia. The Ukrainian security service conducts investigation into the circumstances why they didn't fight. In Zaporizhzhia, they fought back. There was a battle on the site of the nuclear power plant. There was a Russian shelling from the tanks and missiles. One of the buildings caught fire. Were the defenders of non-defenders of Chernobyl right or wrong? Were the people who decided to fight back at Zaporizhzhia right or wrong? They were making their decisions on the fly. We don't know. There are no clear, legally, morally, otherwise, instructions of what to do. The International Atomic Energy Agency, for the first 2 weeks, they wouldn't even mention word Russia in their statements. This is a UN-associated organization. Russia is one of the major stakeholders. It provides significant part of the budget of the International Agency Association. The paycheck of employees, the election or re-election of the head of the International Atomic Energy Agency, Director General, depends on the Russian votes. So legally, the last document about the warfare and nuclear weapons that exist there comes from the late 1960s. And the nuclear sites are there treated together with dikes and hydroelectric power stations. So there is no legal base, there is no protocols, there is no institutional ability to deal with the crisis like that. And I want to think, I wish that that would be the last war that would take place generally in the world, or on the areas and in the countries that have nuclear power plant. But how realistic this hopes are, especially given what is happening today in Ukraine. The war is far from over, but we see already some trends that emerged during this war that can allow us to look forward and see and predict what can happen. This is a photo coming from downtown Kyiv from the first weeks after the start of the all-out war. This is a process, it captures the process of the removal, of the demolition of the statue of monument to Russian-Ukrainian friendship that was built in the late 1980s during the last decade of the existence of the Soviet Union. Surprisingly, that monument in downtown Kyiv survived the annexation of the Crimea in 2014. It didn't survive the February and March of 2022. And this destruction of the monument, removal of the monument, is something that is symbolic of generally processes that are taking place in Ukraine. There is a mass renaming of the streets and towns and so on and so forth. After 2014, the names of the communist leaders were removed. Now the issue are the names of the Russian cultural figures. Mass removal of the monuments to Pushkin. A big debate that continues today in Ukraine whether the biggest musical school in Kyiv, it is right there at Maidan in downtown, the conservatory that is named after Pyotr Tchaikovsky, whether it should still have the Tchaikovsky name or not. The people who say it should have this name make a very interesting argument, saying that, well, Tchaikovsky, really, his grandparents came from Ukraine. But that's the sort of the divisions that exist today. The mayor of Kharkiv, the second largest city, mostly Russian-speaking city, 40 kilometers away from the Russian border, tells today that the hatred of Russia is higher in that city, Russian-speaking city, than it was probably, or it is, in Ukrainian-speaking west of the country and of the republic. So you see a major transformation really in terms of the national thinking, national identity, and relations between Russia and Ukraine that will certainly affect the generation that goes through this war, and probably one or two generations after that. That's the scars in people's memory that will live, will not disappear tomorrow with the start or not start of peaceful negotiations. So Russia and Ukraine really are on a different track now in any imaginable way, from the political system with democracy continuing in Ukraine, autocracy becoming stronger in Russia, but also in terms of cultural thinking and thinking about their identity, which is certainly a very important factor in if you think about the history not just history, but when you think about today and when you think about the future, what will happen there. So I don't see suddenly Russian-Ukrainian relations turning on the issue of whether Putin is in power or not in power. This is a long-term process. Another very important trend that is already obvious today, and that goes beyond the Russian-Ukrainian relations per se. And Russian-Ukrainian relations per se are also important for the post-Soviet space. I discussed that earlier. Russia and Ukraine, two largest post-Soviet republics. So that will have impact on Belarus. That will have impact on Kazakhstan. That will have impact on Georgia, the way how the war turns out. But even beyond the post-Soviet space, what we see now are many elements that certainly remind me about the Cold War, about the Iron Curtain, and about the rebuilding and recreation of transatlantic alliance that existed between the United States and Europe during the Cold War. In Russian case, we see reorientation of Russian trade from Europe, from the west toward the east, mostly China and India. This is trend that really predates the end of the Cold War. The Russian supplies of gas and energy to Europe really started with detente, started in the early 1970s. What we see today is really coming to an end of the era, of the page, of the chapter in the Russian relations with Europe that started at least in the early 1970s. So we are talking about at least half of a century tradition. And you maybe have a better feeling and better understanding of what is going on in terms of this reorientation. From what I see in the media, the way how I understand it, that this is also something that can't be just turned all around within 1 year or a few years, that this is a beginning of a longer term. Europe tries to divest itself generally from Germany again goes divest itself from nuclear. France doesn't do that, but from the fossil fuels for sure. So concerns about the climate change, all of that comes together. So I don't see this trend really suddenly going back or suddenly disappearing. This is a long-term trend. We see also reorientation of Russia toward the east, something that I already talked about before. History can provide some materials in terms of the parallels. This is the poster coming certainly from the 1950s. And the close Russia-Chinese relationship is not something that never existed before. There was a history of the 1950s in particular, plus minus 10 years of close relationship. The relationship were really oriented against the at that time against Europe, the United States, and U.S. allies in Asia Pacific as well. At that time, of course, Russia was in the driving seat. China was a more revolutionary and more adventurous member of that alliance, with Russia being the Soviet Union at that time being more conservative. Now the roles had changed. China, certainly economically, is in the leading position in that alliance that is not yet there, but certainly the possibility is strong that it will be there and will be formalized. And Russia is more adventurous and is prepared to all sorts of confrontations and adventures. So that is a change there. What we know from the alliance of the Cold War era, that there were too many unresolved issues, tensions, suspicions between Beijing and Moscow back in the 1950s. And I don't see that this new alliance, still in the making, has actually less problems and less tensions and potential conflict areas than the one that existed before. So let me repeat of what I just said in terms of the trends that this war had already set. And while we're not 100% sure, but the chances are that these trends will continue. The first of them linked to the fact that this war on the Russian part is an imperial war with an attempt to establish control over the former part of the empire, either Tsarist Empire or Soviet Empire. We don't know when it will end, but long term we know how it will end. The age of empires is gone or is coming to an end. So the long term, we know that Ukraine, which defended its sovereignty today, will continue to be an independent and sovereign state. We can assume that the trend that we see today of Ukraine's integration into the European structures will continue. That's the most likely scenario that I see, and this is the development that is already there. What we can assume will happen, and is happening today, is disappearance of so-called gray zones in Europe. The gray zones that Ukraine was there, not member of NATO, not member of the European Union, but leaning toward the West. The same is probably true for Moldova, which would be an argument in a sense that a sort of a division that was there during the Cold War coming, with Finland joining NATO, the model of Finlandization and neutrality that existed during the Cold War becomes actually more problematic now than it was before the start of the all-out war back in February of 2022. Another important trend is that the ideas of creation of multipolar world, with Russia being at the center of one of the poles in that world, are probably having, in case of Russia, are bleak at best for the next 10 to 20 years. What we are witnessing, certainly, if not implosion, then weakening of Russia in military terms, in economic terms, in political terms as well. And that will probably continue. On the other hand, we see a return of the Cold War era trends toward re-emergence of a bipolar world. At least that's the trend that we can see today, with United States continuing to be one of the poles in this bipolar world, as it was during the Cold War, and another pole emerging in China or around China. This is not a very optimistic scenario, or not very optimistic future that I have presented to you. But one thing that I'm, as a historian, absolutely convinced in, is that history never repeats itself. It rhymes, as Mark Twain had said. there probably will be some elements of the old Cold War era world that will be translated, transformed into this new world order that is being in the process of formation. But we know for sure that the world that existed between the end of the Cold War and the start of the Russo-Ukrainian War, full of promise, full of belief that the back pages of history will not come back, that world is over. We are facing new realities. And the only optimistic really element that I can think about is that today, unlike back in the 50s or 60s or 70s, we have already a lot of experience of surviving the first Cold War. And now it's the time to go back to that period and to look not only what we got wrong back then, but what we got right, not to allow the nuclear war, the nuclear conflicts to repeat themselves again in the new world. And like it was the case in the Cold War, I am sure it will be the case under new circumstances. Business, the leaders of business communities have their role to play. And I am sure that role will be as positive in this new context and new circumstances as it was back during the Cold War. Thank you very much for your attention.